Another important way DLD impacts academics is with narratives. Narrative language is basically telling or retelling a real or imagined event. And some of us would find it easier to just think of it as storytelling, but the fancy word you will encounter in the language world is narrative language. When we tell somebody about our day, share about an event that occurred in our childhood, or make up a story and express it to others, we are engaging in narrative language. Narrative language is highly complex and is known as a higher order language skill. It involves focused attention, memory, and being able to take someone else's perspective, all while also finding specific words to convey an intended meaning, using complex grammar, and organizing thoughts in a logical, sequential manner. When we read a story in a Western narrative style, starting off with fairy tales as a young child, there is information provided about the setting, the characters, what the problem in the story is, and what the solution in the story is. We're often provided with information about the feelings that the characters have, and there's often dialogue between characters. And so, when you understand that type of structure and Western narrative expectations, it can give you a good framework to understand the story, and later on to produce a story, either through a retell or a newly generated story. But if that structure is not something a child with DLD understands, it can be that much more challenging then to understand everything else because they don't even have a framework for it, not to mention their vocabulary and grammar deficits. When a child with DLD is asked to write their own story, it may be viewed as incomplete because they didn't include any dialogue between characters or any information about the setting or maybe the solution. They might not have known that there's supposed to be a problem or a solution in the story. We can see now how a child with DLD might not know how to get started, partly because they lack understanding of the basic narrative framework and so just feel overwhelmed staring at that blank piece of paper in front of them. Now, before we go any further, I want to acknowledge something. The type of storytelling expectations in North American schools tend to be based on European-style storytelling. Most of us are familiar with the story of the Three Little Pigs that likely originated in England. There are many versions of this story, but all have clearly defined characters, a setting, problem, and a solution. When children grow up in homes with other cultures, the style of storytelling can be different. In my home, for example, we speak English, French, and Chinese. My husband is an immigrant to Canada from Hong Kong, and we know that storytelling expectations are different in our two backgrounds. So it's helpful to our kids to discuss similarities and differences between both styles to help them increase their level of cultural and self-awareness. Both ways are equally wonderful, and it is so enriching to learn about both. Then we want our children to learn to code switch, meaning engage with different expectations in different contexts to be successful. So perhaps have a chat about this with your child's teacher. Maybe the teacher could also include stories from your culture as an enriching way for all students to learn about how storytelling styles can differ between languages and cultures. If you're interested in learning more, check out the Sue and Cho article in the reference list. Briefly, it tells us that to produce culturally appropriate stories, one has to be aware of the stylistic differences in storytelling between languages and cultures. They discussed research showing that, and I presume these kids are white American children, they tend to provide more elaborate and detailed descriptions of past events, comment more on their own preferences, and give more personal judgments and opinions when compared to East Asian children who tend to talk about their past events in a succinct, less detailed way without referring to their own thoughts and feelings. We also know from the Asha Wire article in the reference list that some African American children tend to use a call-response interaction when telling stories, with the listener participating much more in the exchange. When that listener participation is not provided due to the teacher coming from a different cultural background with different expectations, that child could be at a disadvantage. Another example I find fascinating is that in West African stories, the idea of time tends to be more fluid. The audience in many West African cultures is much more involved in the storytelling, and the storyteller is often expected to end with a closing formula with significant audience participation. If the storytelling style and expectations from your culture are different from the style taught in North American schools, it's important to have a chat about this with your child's teacher. Having teachers and therapists understand and validate different cultural expectations can be so helpful to your child, as no style is superior to another. They're just different ways to focus when storytelling. The importance of narrative language skills has been studied extensively by researchers. If you want to go deeper, there are additional research articles listed in our reference section. Studies have shown that the ability to produce a narrative, meaning the ability to tell a story in preschool, predicts reading comprehension performance in the 4th, 7th, and 10th grades. Other researchers also showed that narrative skill at school entry predicted reading comprehension performance 10 years later. We know there's a very strong relationship between early oral narrative skills and later reading comprehension. Being able to tell a story is not the only challenging aspect of narrative language skills for our kids. They will also often struggle to understand stories as well, especially understanding them on a deeper level. One particular area of difficulty is answering inference questions, where one has to use clues in the story and background knowledge to figure something out. If it wasn't explicitly stated, but it was quite obvious to you or I because there were many clues in the story and we were able to read between the lines, our children with DLD may still not quite get it. Or they may learn to make that inference, but they're not necessarily easily able to justify their answer. For example, we may read a story and conclude that the character was afraid of heights, because when the character walked by a ladder, she started sweating and her heart started racing. Later, when somebody mentioned skydiving, she started trembling and she never liked going sightseeing on mountains and so on. Well, for our kids with DLD, if a fact isn't explicitly stated, it can be harder for them to read between the lines, or even if they were able to do so, it can be hard for them to justify their answer. That means to say how they knew that the character was afraid of heights. This is something that can be worked on in therapy, and you can also model it at home with guidance from your child's SLP. Now, when your child is reading a paragraph or a story, or when you're reading it aloud to them, they may also struggle to identify the main idea. This challenge often arises because they have misunderstood or skipped through some of the vocabulary words they didn't know, and they may have also misunderstood some of the grammar, like if passive voice or another unfamiliar type of sentence was used. When this is the case, it's not realistic for us to expect them to be able to identify the main idea of a paragraph, because they need to be working on comprehension at the word or maybe the sentence level first. Stay tuned for strategies on how to help your child with higher order language challenges in the next sub-lesson.